Catherine O'Hara was a name that could make a room light up. The very mention of her name brought smiles, laughter, and memories of characters who had become part of our lives. From her early days on SCTV to unforgettable roles in films like Beetlejuice and Home Alone, she was more than an actress. She was a force, a beacon of comedic brilliance. Millions adored her. Fans across generations held her close to their hearts, and her impact on comedy was undeniable. And yet, on January 30th, 2026, the world was forced to confront an unthinkable truth. Catherine O'Hara was dead. But even in death, her story was far from simple. In fact, it was about to take a turn that nobody, fans, friends, or family, could have anticipated. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The news broke quietly at first, a press release from her publicist confirming the death of the 71-year-old actress. But behind the clinical words of condolences and grief-stricken statements, there was something darker brewing. The first reports were cautious, almost hesitant, hinting at unusual circumstances surrounding her passing. Friends whispered, colleagues were visibly shaken, and while the world mourned, detectives quietly stepped in, beginning an investigation that would soon reveal secrets most people never imagined could exist within the life of someone so beloved. Have you ever felt the shock of losing someone you thought was invincible? That moment when the person who seemed larger than life, the one who could always make you laugh, suddenly feels fragile, mortal, gone? That's the space the public found themselves in. But what made this story extraordinary wasn't just her death. It was what investigators discovered in the aftermath, and the role her family, her own blood, may have played in it. The autopsy report came back, and what it revealed stunned even seasoned medical examiners. Inside her body, traces of a compound were found, a chemical that should never have been there. Not a prescription, not something her doctors had ever recommended, something foreign, something unusual, and frighteningly potent. These weren't just anomalies. They were red flags screaming foul play. And when toxicologists examined the compound, they were left with more questions than answers. How did it get there? Who had access to it? Could this have been accidental? Or was it intentional? The world suddenly shifted from mourning to suspicion. Headlines screamed about the mysterious substance. Social media exploded with theories, accusations, and speculation. But no one outside the investigation knew the full story. Not yet. What we can say is this. It wasn't just an ordinary death, and it certainly wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone, somewhere, had taken steps to ensure that this chemical entered her life and her body. And that's when attention turned inward, to her family, to the people closest to her, to the person who had been beside her for decades. Or so everyone thought. Detectives began digging into her household, her routines, her interactions. And slowly, a picture began to form that was almost too horrifying to believe. Her eldest son, Matthew Welch, became a figure of interest. At first, no one wanted to even suggest that someone so intimately close could be involved in a tragedy of this scale. The idea seemed impossible. But the more investigators uncovered, the harder it became to ignore. Records showed that someone had been purchasing rare, hard-to-trace chemicals online. Chemicals that could have caused exactly the kind of harm Catherine had suffered. And the trail led, incredibly, to her own son. Using a fake identity, he had managed to order these substances in a way that was meant to evade detection. It sounded like something out of a thriller. It sounded impossible. Yet, the evidence was there, irrefutable, and chilling. Imagine the emotional gravity of that moment for the family. Friends, colleagues, the wider world. They were already grappling with the loss of a comedic legend. And now, whispers of betrayal, of deception, of unimaginable choices within her own household began to emerge. How do you process the fact that the person who was supposed to protect you, to love you, might instead have been the architect of your demise? How does a family begin to deal with suspicion at this level, when grief is already suffocating? And more importantly, how does the world react when someone it has celebrated for decades becomes the center of a mystery so dark it defies comprehension? As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a timeline that was almost cinematic in its precision. The purchases, the chemicals, the interactions with vendors, all meticulously planned. And yet, even with all this, questions remained. Did Matthew act alone? Was there a motive that explained these actions beyond the obvious? Or was this just the tip of an iceberg, one that would expose even more secrets buried deep within a family that the public had assumed they knew? The tension was palpable, the stakes monumental, and the world watched as a beloved figure's story spiraled from one of joy and laughter to one of tragedy, suspicion, and intrigue. What makes this story even more compelling is how the public consumed it. Overnight, Catherine O'Hara went from being remembered for her comedic genius to being at the center of a story filled with betrayal, chemistry, and crime. Fans couldn't reconcile the joyful memories of her performances with the dark narrative unfolding in real life. And the deeper the investigation went, the more contradictions appeared. People close to her insisted Matthew could never be involved. Others hinted at hidden disputes, financial struggles, unspoken resentments. It was a web of human complexity, emotion, and secrecy that only grew denser as days passed. So why does this matter now? Why, years after her career was cemented in history, does this story demand attention? Because it's a story that defies expectations, challenges assumptions, and forces us to question how well we really know those closest to us. It's a narrative about trust, deception, and the extremes of human behavior. Elements that grip attention because they are universal, deeply emotional, and terrifyingly real. The investigation wasn't just about uncovering what happened to Catherine O'Hara. It became a probe into the darker corners of a family's life, revealing that sometimes the greatest threats come from the people we think we know best. And just when it seemed that the world was beginning to grasp the full scope of the tragedy, detectives made a breakthrough. A single email, a small but critical piece of evidence, confirmed what everyone had feared but hoped wasn't true. The purchase records, cross-referenced with her final days, painted a picture too precise to be coincidence. The autopsy wasn't just a medical report anymore. It was a roadmap pointing to a person. The one person who had both opportunity and, shockingly, access. Her son. As the world digested this revelation, more questions bubbled to the surface. How long had this been going on? Were there signs that friends or family had missed? Could anyone have predicted this? And most importantly, what did it mean for her legacy? Catherine O'Hara had spent a lifetime bringing joy to others, but now, in death, her story was a cautionary tale, a tragic puzzle, and a mystery that gripped the public's imagination in ways her performances never could. The scene was set. The public, the media, and the family itself were all on the edge of discovery. And yet, even with the son identified, even with purchases traced and chemicals accounted for, there remained one critical question. Why? Why would Matthew Welch put himself in such a position, risking not just his freedom but the memory of his mother, the trust of those around him, and the public's adoration of a family that had seemed untouchable? And as law enforcement prepared to make the next move, one thing became clear. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The introduction closes here, leaving the audience with shock, tension, and an emotional investment that demands continuation. The story of Catherine O'Hara's death is no longer just a news item. It is a gripping narrative of mystery, betrayal, and human complexity, and what follows promises revelations that will haunt, surprise, and captivate. What was Catherine O'Hara doing in the days leading up to her death? The answer, it turns out, is more complicated and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Just a week before her passing, Catherine had been the picture of vitality, attending a small industry event in Los Angeles, laughing, joking, and even signing autographs for fans who hadn't seen her in decades. But behind the camera flashes and the smiles, there were subtle hints that something was off. Little things that, in retrospect, scream of warning signs no one noticed, or perhaps no one wanted to see. Have you ever seen someone you love appear completely normal one moment, and then later discover everything you thought you knew about their life was only a fragment? That's exactly what Catherine's final days felt like to those who were closest to her. She was meticulous, always organized, precise in her routines, yet there were moments of hesitation that puzzled her friends. A delayed response to messages, a phone call she didn't return, a brief sadness in her eyes. Nothing concrete. Nothing that would make anyone suspect the tragedy that was about to unfold. And yet, there were pieces scattered across those last days. Tiny, nearly invisible threads that would eventually weave together into a terrifying story. Her publicist described her as the same Catherine we all knew, sharp, witty, full of life. But friends in private said something different. There were whispers of tension with her son, Matthew. Small disagreements that, to outsiders, seemed trivial, but insiders knew they were more than that. A comment here, a dismissal there, a subtle argument over finances. No one thought it was anything serious, but as detectives later uncovered, the cracks in family harmony were not just cracks, they were canyons. And Catherine, despite her outward strength and resilience, was navigating them in ways only she could understand. In those last days, Catherine kept a routine. Morning coffee on her terrace, long walks with her dog, and afternoons spent reading scripts or reviewing projects. She had an energy about her, a determination to remain active, to stay involved in her craft. Friends marveled at it. She never slowed down, one close colleague recalled. Even when she was tired, she found a way to keep moving. And yet, beneath that determination, there were signs of fatigue that no one could explain. Small bruises on her arms, a lingering cough she brushed off, nights where she seemed unusually restless. The medical records show nothing alarming, but the autopsy later revealed that something invisible, something sinister, had already begun to infiltrate her body. It's almost impossible to reconcile the Catherine O'Hara the public saw with the woman who would meet her untimely end. She laughed in interviews, joked with fans, and even rehearsed lines for a project that had been slated to begin filming in the spring. Yet the private journals she kept, diaries later discovered by investigators, painted a more complicated picture. Entries hinting at unease, at tension with her son, at questions about her health that she didn't voice aloud. Pages filled with reflections on family, aging, and trust. Nothing concrete enough to signal danger, but in hindsight, a disturbing foreshadowing. There were also moments of generosity and warmth in those final days. Catherine hosted a small dinner for close friends at her Los Angeles home. The night was full of laughter, stories from the past, and the kind of intimacy only a few people ever experienced with her. Yet even there, subtle contradictions appeared. She seemed distracted at times, staring off into space as if listening to someone. Or something that no one else could hear. Friends later described fleeting moments where she seemed unsettled, almost wary, glancing toward her son in ways that were subtle, yet loaded with meaning. Matthew's presence during these days is particularly significant. On paper, he appeared supportive, attentive, involved in his mother's life. Yet detectives later noted inconsistencies in his account of her routines, her behaviors, and even her final days. He claimed he was always nearby, but phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements suggested otherwise. Moments when he said he was at home coincided with deliveries of rare chemicals, timestamps that seemed almost too precise to be coincidence. And Catherine herself, as her diaries hinted, had growing unease about events she didn't fully understand. Have you ever noticed how tiny details can become monumental in hindsight? A misplaced key, a forgotten appointment, a conversation that seems insignificant until the larger context emerges. In Catherine's case, these small anomalies were scattered across her last week. A delivery that she didn't remember ordering, a phone call from someone she didn't recognize, a fleeting headache that she dismissed as stress or fatigue. Each moment seemed harmless alone, but together, they created a pattern that would horrify the world once the full investigation was revealed. Then there were the moments that seemed ordinary but were anything but. Catherine went for her morning walks, as she always did, accompanied by her dog. She visited local cafes, exchanged pleasantries with baristas, and ran errands that most of us would consider mundane. Yet, according to investigators, these excursions provided opportunities for subtle manipulation. Someone close to her had access to her schedule, knew when she would be alone, and had the ability to insert that mysterious compound into her life without detection. A question that remains haunting. How could someone orchestrate such a meticulous plan while appearing normal, supportive, loving? Her friends, looking back, admit that there were tiny warning signs they now regret missing. A note left on the kitchen counter. A fleeting glance exchanged with Matthew that seemed loaded but was dismissed at the time. Catherine, ever discreet, didn't vocalize her concerns fully. She was private, protective of her family's reputation, unwilling to cast suspicion even when her instincts suggested unease. In that sense, her strength may have been a weakness, shielding the public, and perhaps even herself, from seeing the danger looming just out of sight. Chapter 1 is complete. The scene is set. The final days are recounted, the tension is rising, and the first clues pointing toward Matthew's involvement are established, leaving the audience desperate to understand exactly what happened in the hours, minutes, and decisions that led to Catherine's death.